Hello and welcome to Q's News. This is Raza Rumi and I am going to talk about the plight of British Pakistani youth and why do the surveys conducted by the government consistently show that their educational attainment is low and that they are out of employment or training programs, as the highest number of young people within the minority communities in the UK happen to be British Pakistanis who are neither in college or any training program or nor employed between the ages of 16 to 24. This data is based on most recent surveys conducted a few years ago and released last year, but we are picking them up right at the start of 2024 so that we can start a series of conversations on what is actually happening within these communities, how far these numbers are reliable, what do they tell us, and what needs to be done. I'm joined by Yas Hussain, who is an entrepreneur, an investor, and a blogger, and he was raised in northern England and now lives in London, so knows different parts of the UK rather well, but also since he is from the British Pakistani community, he knows them intimately and has far greater insights than numbers or mere data would tell us. Thank you, Yas, and of course, you are an ideal person to talk to because you're an entrepreneur and you're in business, but tell us what is happening with the British Pakistani youth. Why are so many of them among the minority communities not in college or not employed? What's going on?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Reza, first and foremost for having me, and it's a pleasure and reciprocated, as you say. There are numerous issues at play here. First, let us just dissect for a moment what you said there in terms of, one, there's a problem across the board with people of a certain age group, that's 16 to 25 year olds, which you hinted at. Now, there's a significant proportion of them who are not in higher education and nor are they in work. That's a huge problem because there shouldn't really be that scale of a problem, and there is. The second issue to look at is when you drill into it, why are Pakistani people even more prominent in terms of being a problem compared to the other people across society and even within the black and minority ethnic groups. These issues, really, first thing that needs to be done is to look at the genesis of the problem. Education ought to be a right for every individual, irrespective of race and irrespective of ethnicity. What we find is that certain communities, and in particular the black and minority ethnic communities, tend to have lower expectations. This is because at a very early age they have ceilings which are put in place both within their own communities, by their parents, and also by their schools, and those ceilings limit and impede what they can achieve later on in life. And when you set the expectation bar so low, people fall below it. You really have to have a mindset where an individual at a young age feels that he or she can achieve the very highest of levels. But when they actually set about a pathway which shows that actually you can't do these things, it's not within your capability because you're from a certain background, then that limits what they can do. So education for these people tends to be a luxury, not an expectation or a right. That's essentially one of the core issues which is driving these factors, and that's why you're finding, as you point out, 1 in 10 of people in this age group aren't either working and nor are they in education. They are essentially lost within the system as non-persons, if you like.
So do you think it has to do with the families, the communities they grow up in, the environment, or the general environment in which the political and social environment in which, let's call a spade, racism plays a major role? I mean, you know, I live in the US and I know how embedded and structural racist obstacles are because certain communities are never allowed to come up to that level or don't have the right opportunities or don't have the right incentives.
Sure.
So is it equally applicable to these communities? Because we are talking here not just about Pakistanis, but also Bangladeshis.
Yeah.
Because they're pretty close, you know.
In terms of the numbers, the numbers are fairly close for both those groups. Now, in what you mentioned several points, I would say all of those issues are a factor to varying degrees. I mean, let me just look at my situation. When I was born in the UK and I went to school here, I was the only Pakistani in my year.
Oh.
I was the only Asian in my year. So I see it from that perspective. And when I look back retrospectively, I see what the issues are, you see. And it's a case of, if you are different or perceived to be different or not in the right category, as it were, in inverted commas, and that category is that if you're a minority or you're particularly from a certain type of minority or a certain religion or certain race, then again, as I say, limits and impediments are put before you, and these obstacles for a child can seem to be insurmountable, and that's what dumbs down and diminishes your expectations. So when I went through schooling, it was not uncommon on an ordinary day to be called Paki, for instance. Not that they were racist, but that's because they perceived me to be different.
Yes.
And people turned a blind eye to it, and teachers didn't know how to deal with it. And so you do come away thinking, well, actually, am I different in certain ways? And so that attitude, if you like, carries with you throughout your life, and you may make adaptations and changes, but it doesn't allow you to catapult yourself as high as you might otherwise. So these things which get drilled into you at a very early age are very, very important. Now, things have moved on since the 80s and 90s, and there's been a lot of progress now, and schools are different, they recognize these issues, and everybody is accommodated to some extent, far better and more in a more efficacious manner than they used to be. But it's still far from perfect, and we look to the politicians for solutions, but nowadays the politicians create more problems than solutions, and that's obviously another issue which needs to be looked at. But the reality is what you pointed out is a very salient issue. When people came to this country from the Indian subcontinent, and let's look at the people from Pakistan, they came as manual workers predominantly. And as manual workers, their idea was literally to make as much money as possible with a view to returning some of that money to the country of their origin. But over time, they decided to stay. But they never had an expectation that their children would go through the education system, be properly schooled, and come out of the other side in very prestigious jobs or in academia or higher education at the very highest levels. And so automatically, even if not consciously mentioned to those children, subconsciously they've set that expectation. You are not expected to achieve certain levels that your, for instance, white counterparts might be expected to do. So you're always subordinated, or the mindset is one of a person that's subordinated to others. And that is a very significant factor which carries with you throughout life. It's the old saying about you have to sail on the sea of ambition to land on the shores of success. But if your ambition is diminished and attenuated at a very early age, then it's very difficult for you to swim across that channel and to land on those shores where you can actually deliver your potential, which you inherently have.
But yes, that's you really explained it well, and I totally agree with you. But remember that the Indians and the Chinese also migrated to the UK, but the performance of those young people in those communities is far better than Pakistanis or Bangladeshis. So does it have to do with, they're coming from the same region by and large, the Indian subcontinent you refer to. Of course, China is a different continent, I would say. But what's going on there? Why are the Indian youths far ahead of the Bangladeshi and Pakistani counterparts?
It's a very good point. And the statistics can, as I say, can be skewed in whichever way you want it. But if you take the broad trajectory of those figures, it is quite right. Indians tend to be performing better, so do the Chinese. So let's just zoom in a little for a second and see what's at play here, what is going on. And then again, it comes down to discipline. If you're living, for instance, in a household with or in a community with very low literacy amongst the parents, very high unemployment, impoverished backgrounds, low incomes, high crime rates. So let's say, for example, I'm not picking out any community, but if you're in Handsworth in Birmingham and that's what you're surrounded by, poor schooling, poor teachers, poor literacy with the parents, manual workers, and no ambition, and a lack of discipline, because the children tend to spend time between themselves, a lot of crime going around, and essentially you end up with children which are the product of their society. Juxtapose that with the Chinese and the Indians, who will be at slightly better schools because their parents were slightly better educated, and as a result of which they've managed to instill better discipline. I'm not talking about moral values here, I'm talking about educational discipline and educational principles, and an expectation that you are expected to go to higher education and beyond that in prestigious positions, in professions. When you have that set at an early age, then, as I say, it delivers the results and yields benefits later on in life. So my view, not based on the statistics but on the anecdotal evidence, is that the Chinese and Indian people are better placed and better positioned compared to Pakistani and Bangladeshis, because they instill that discipline and that expectation, and they have access to better schooling, often private schools, and that's why their children end up with far greater outcomes than compared to the Pakistani and Bangladeshis.
Okay, that makes sense. But you mentioned about the neighborhoods and obviously the role of poverty, right? So again, the data, I was looking at the numbers, the data presented to the British Parliament last year showed that once again, no surprises there, the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi households, roughly 40% of them are what you would call low income, a little higher than the black communities, black and people from the Caribbean, and then the Indians again are much lower, or less than half of the Indian, or those who identify themselves as Indian households, are poor or in the low income category. So there's a direct correlation with education, and perhaps if you don't have better education or training or skills, you don't get higher paying jobs, which means you don't address generational poverty. So about this poverty and exclusion thing, because something is going on there. Now tell us, I mean, you know these communities well because you grew up in the north, you live in London, you travel all over the country and abroad, of course. So what happens? I mean, why are these low income households again concentrated in these two communities? I mean, honestly, I don't have any, I'm through you, I'm trying to investigate this.
Investigate what the problem is. And obviously you have to understand the problem in order to be able to provide solutions to it. You're absolutely right, you've hit the nail on the head. There's a very strong correlation between having poverty in a community and that community not having good results for the children. And this is something which is, it's a class issue as well. If you really look at it, the people who end up at Oxford and Cambridge or the elite universities are not particularly in terms of natural ability of a higher intellect compared to the others. And algorithms have figured this out, and studies have been done which demonstrate it. However, they have better backgrounds, and they tend to be of more privileged backgrounds, and therefore they end up in better institutions, and those institutions teach them better, they're able to cope better, and also there's a sense of empowerment. These kids from these privileged backgrounds feel, in inverted commas, that they are better, and when you carry yourself in that way, you feel that you can achieve things whilst others feel that they can't. So until you address the issue of poverty, it's very difficult to address the issue of educational attainment. And that goes hand in hand. And this is where, unfortunately, governments haven't really addressed the problem. Because what does this poverty do? It's not just within the household. Because if you think about it, if you take a manual worker or somebody who's unemployed on very low income, either way, and they come home, the last thing on their mind is how can they promote their child, by, for example, spending time to assist them with their schooling. They're worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about their electricity bill. They're worried about, mortgage payments which might be going out, or the housing benefit not coming in. So those issues, are more prominent for that family compared to, what is my child studying at school? What's the syllabus? And so suddenly there's a bit of a disconnect here. Now, in order to improve that, you have to improve the circumstances of the people living in that community. Because if you ensure that people remain impoverished, and then what they will do is they'll never get out of those circumstances. So you have to have this, to use the government's phrase, a levelling up, not just between different regions, but within the same region and different, people who are impoverished, people who are better off in a certain town. You have to make sure that all children have the right to a good education.
But so yeah, exactly. But I mean, about this, coming back to this poverty issue, because these are interlinked. So what needs to be done? Because we were talking about business, you mentioned that word.
Yeah.
But what do you think can, realistically speaking, the British government do?
Yeah, what
Tories or Labour?
Okay, let's look at the government's initiatives. In 2015, the Conservative Party took up an initiative, and they said that they want to increase by some 20% the number of people from BAME backgrounds who are going into higher education. And they failed them miserably so, right? Why did they fail? Because they never really took steps to understand the problem.
Right.
So they never really replaced the teachers at these failed schools. Because it's not just about telling a failed school, you must do better. How can they do better? Get better teachers. And also give the school greater facilities in order for them to be able to translate that into success for its pupils. But what they just do is literally throw some money at it, don't examine the problem, and then expect a different outcome. And when that outcome doesn't happen, they just scratch their heads and try to blame the other parties. It doesn't work like that. Governments don't tend to provide good solutions, and we're looking back at the last 20, 30 years and we realise that they haven't. And in particular in the last 15 years, this existing government really hasn't achieved anything. Schools now, are producing children who may be achieving certain grades, but anecdotal evidence says the learning outcomes are terrible. They don't read very well, they don't write very well, and they're not well equipped, and their numeracy skills are very poor, but they're not equipped for, which is the second part of what you said. It's not just about the education, it's the education system for these people, producing kids who can actually benefit an employer. So are they suitable for the workplace? Clearly not, because 1 in 10 should not be unemployed. In the case of Pakistani people, 1 in 6 of young people under the age of 25 are unemployed. That is a tragedy. Right?
Yeah.
And essentially what you're doing is you're killing off that person, you're killing off the ambition. It reminds me of, and I look back on this, I read this a poem by Winston Auden many years ago, and I look back on it now retrospectively, and it hits home. And it wasn't to do with schooling or young people. It was actually about the mourning and the grief one experiences when someone passes away, and it's called the funeral blues. And in that, Auden actually talks about the bigger things in life becoming meaningless to that person who's having this grief. And he talks about pack away the moon and dismantle the sun,
yes.
right? And pour away the ocean, and sweep the woods, for now nothing will ever come good. And that, if you think about it, is how many young people will feel when they realise their school does nothing for them.
Yeah.
They think they will achieve nothing.
Yeah.
And then they go into higher education, there's nothing for them. They try to get employment and reasonable employment, and they find that they can't. They go onto social media and all they see is bright lights, big city, razzmatazz, big cars, lots of money. So what they do is they think, actually, we can't navigate a path from here to get to there. So they look for the shortcuts. They look towards the criminal gangs. They look to do different things, or then they become rebellious.
Right.
And that rebellious streak in them will cause them to actually separate from society, be critical, but not be productive.
Yeah.
So you end up being useless. So to come back to what I meant about the poem, you have actually killed off that person's ambition. And that person is essentially grieving, and that grief translates into a rebellion. And that's when they all say, the politicians do nothing for us.
Yeah.
You know, we're not interested. You lose interest in everything, really. And you're only looking then to try to claim your place in society, but society has rejected you because you don't fit the mold of being a productive member of it. And so it's a serious problem. And politicians really aren't getting it. And in particular in relation to the BAME communities, and especially so the Pakistani community, the politicians tend to magnify the problem rather than assisting it. If you look at people from BAME backgrounds who have entered the political circles, and let's highlight a few of them. We've got...
I want you to talk about the self-hating brown politicians, you know, who want immigrants to be thrown out, people from Rwanda to be sent back, no asylum, I mean, denigrating the role.
That's right, yes. And this
caricaturing migrants and immigrants.
Yes.
Now they themselves are children of immigrants.
Well, the irony is, and the hypocrisy as well, really, where they say, well, actually, we have benefited hugely from being immigrants in this country, and now we are making a valuable contribution to it, in their words. Well, that's because you've been afforded the opportunity, yet they want to impede others from having the same opportunity. So you may say,
are they impeding, or are they pleasing the white nationalist or white racist sentiments? Because that's what Conservative Party's core base is. Sometimes I also view it like that. They're trying to assimilate, quote unquote, in the wrong manner.
Yeah, well, obviously, are they actors who are playing the tune to their masters, or is it a case of these are their genuine beliefs? Well, either or, it leads to the same negative, detrimental outcome. But I mean, within the Conservative Party, for example, I mean, David Cameron took great steps in order to increase the diversity of the party, because at the time the Tory party was really the exclusive reserve of white middle class, white middle to upper class, Oxbridge types who were well read, and PPEs from Oxford. But he did take steps in order to make it more diverse. But even within that diverse base, which is included, if you look at it, most of them are from Oxbridge or from good universities, from they've been at leading institutions or at leading companies at the very highest levels. So they're not really representative of the people we're talking about who they've left behind. So what they should be doing is bringing those people with them. But far from it. Suella Braverman says, well, actually, she starts to stereotype an entire nation of Pakistanis and say, well, actually, all of you behave in a certain way. And obviously depicts them as being paedophiles and which they're not. That's a very small minority of people who our communities will reject.
Within the minority.
Within the minority, yes. And everybody says what they do is wrong, but nobody's supporting them. Yet she will lambast an entire community on the basis of the actions of a few. And then, they talk about the multiculturalism failing at schools.
Yeah, I was about to say that.
But if multiculturalism is failing, they are actually part of the problem by compounding it with these issues. They talk about, our country is being hijacked and it's been invaded, and they tend to talk about the migrants that's right, who are causing these problems. So essentially, looking to politicians for solutions is probably the wrong way. The politicians need to provide some of the money, because obviously money is required in order to implement an initiative which is going to reverse this negative trend and these egregious statistics which you refer to. What I think is needed here is a business solution. It needs companies and larger companies to be able to work with schools and work with these students, and also work with young people when they're trying to get into employment, offer scholarships, offer mentoring schemes, right? And once you do this, suddenly some of those people who have the talent but don't have the pathway that I talked about, they can't navigate through a sort of seamless road, a segue from here to there. Actually, for them, it's a labyrinthine maze, very complicated, and all sorts of impediments in their way. But for them to actually be able to do something, it requires companies to offer these solutions. And I think business is going to be the key driver where you have these mentoring schemes. If you look at housing, for example, governments are very alert to the fact that you can't have certain communities living in London. When it comes to London, not in the rest of the country, but when it comes to London, they've recognised the problem. You can't have certain communities represented by, for example, one race and an impoverished poor backgrounds. So what they try to do is they call it social mobility. They say we have to have, even in the most salubrious and lucrative locations, we have to have people from other backgrounds, low-income backgrounds. You know, we want that literate, you know, and also, you know, from different races, so you can assimilate and promote this multicultural and diverse, you know, approach that they're looking to do. But why not replicate that in schooling?
Yes.
Why not have a bilateral approach, for example, with teachers from Eton? I'm not saying it needs specifically to be Eton or King Edward's or Winchester College, but just as an example, why not have people from those schools attending once or twice a month at these, you know, failed schools, which is, you know, which is where a lot of these kids are coming from, and go to these schools and to bring them up and teach the teachers how to actually teach, and then you know, have bilateral movement between the pupils. You see, that sort of mixing will lift these youngsters from this very low expectations substrate that they're currently sitting upon.
Absolutely. I think business and the role of politicians is vital, but I think also the role of our communities in the United Kingdom is also important, families, you know, and I hope some of them who would watch this, because I think they also need to recognize that how important education, skill development, training is for the future of their children and their children, right?
That's right, yes. And it's coming along. I mean, if you look, as I say, if you look back 20, 30 years ago, very few people had that expectation. Very few people actually felt that their kids were going to go to university and that they were going to come out and be professionals and working in multinational corporations. However, that has changed, but it's not changed enough. What you are seeing is those people who themselves went to university now will be telling their kids actually the importance of education and also how critical it is, and how, you know, that they need to work hard at an early age, and what, you know, possibilities are open to them, and work with them with a view to achieving a very positive you know, outcome later on in life. But those numbers still are dwarfed compared to some of the other communities which we talked about, for example, like the Chinese. So it's going to take generational shifts to do that. But as I say, one of the key parts is to take people out of this vicious circle of poverty, such that they have an ability to look at other things beyond just the short-term needs of putting food on the table, or looking at ensuring that they've got a roof over their head. And until you do that, it's very, very difficult to get these people out of it. And in terms of communities themselves, it needs leadership. It needs role models.
There you go.
Right?
There
it
you
needs
go.
mentors to get these students, the mentees, and to take them somewhere, to guide them, not just in the short term whilst they're at college or just starting work, but throughout their lives, because that's how you get these generational improvements and these shifts. So if you
I think also the role of mosques, you know, the imams in Bangladeshi and Pakistani mosques, I mean, they need to also give this messaging, not just the hereafter, but also look at your current life and this life and your role in this community.
Yes, I think a lot of people, we talked about, you know, why people from the Indian subcontinent, different people, so for example, the Indians don't have this issue and the Pakistanis are, or they have it to a lesser degree. You've hit a very you've hit the nail on the head with the point.
To that, we have to be careful.
It's an issue here is identity. Pakistanis have an identity crisis, because what they're looking at is they are labelled in this country in a very derogatory and negative way. If you see somebody on the street and it's a brown face and somebody wants to debase him, they'll use a detrimental term of Paki.
Yeah, I know.
That's a Pakistani.
I used to study it all the time.
That's right. So you won't see a Pakistani being labelled as Indian if you want to denigrate him.
Paki,
so you end up with a identity issue where if you think you're Pakistani, you've got Suella Braverman labelling you as a paedophile. You've got others labelling you as a Paki, which is a derogatory term. So suddenly you end up thinking, well, what am I? And it's something you don't want to be, perhaps. And so this identity
So I think
crisis,
this is so important.
and this is where the mosques can come into it, because hand in
Absolutely.
hand with this identity crisis, you've got a racial issue where they're talking about you being Pakistani in a not so complimentary manner, but at the same time you've got people talking about Islam in an unfavourable way. So there's this links with terrorism.
Absolutely.
Right? And then there's links about Islam. They're trying to
The
portray
whole
it as
post 9/11 and
quite
the
right.
July, bombings in London,
And so these youth become disaffected, and what they're looking at is they're thinking, well, actually, we get labelled and tarnished by all segments of society, by the media, by the politicians, by everyone else in society.
Absolutely.
And so that disaffected, mindset carries itself. So what do? They go against the system, which is why you'll see people, no matter what the case is, they tend to rebel against Britain,
system,
for example,
yeah.
and against the system itself. And that's something that we need to avoid and we need to reduce. And it is working to some extent, but not in the as efficiently as it should be.
Yes, absolutely. This last point that you raised, I was very hesitant in the first place to take up this issue because often this data vilifies the British Pakistani, or sorry to use the term, Paki community further, because they say, oh, you're poor, you're uneducated, you're unfit, you're a pedophile, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is that, we have to talk about that. We have to acknowledge the fact that there is a problem there. There's a problem with the political system, the racist environment, but there's a problem within the communities as well. So I think what we have to do, Yas, in the coming weeks is pick up on all these issues: the failure of multiculturalism, the schooling system, the entrepreneurial opportunities, the way education system is structured, and the way the political system is structured, and bring in all these issues and see where not just British Pakistanis but Bangladeshis and other members of the larger BAME community are placed, and what do we do in contemporary UK to change this? So
absolutely, you're very much on the ball about it. It's a problem which it doesn't have a single cause. We've already identified multiple factors which are giving rise to this, and therefore the solution is not a one size fits everybody.
Sure.
So the solution has to come from different sources. As I say, I think it's almost certain that it has to have business involvement, it has to have involvement from the local communities,
And the
mentoring schemes,
yeah.
leaderships, governments, and when everyone's in the melting pot and simmering and singing from the same hymn sheet, we'll get somewhere. But for now, as I say, there's more than a paper's width apart between what the desired expectation and outcome is and where we currently are. Right. It's a huge chasm. It needs to be reduced, and we'll look into the ways that it can be done
for sure
in the coming weeks.
For sure. So thank you so much. I wish we had more time, Yas, because this is such a fascinating conversation, but I think we shall continue with this important discussion, because this is something which is rarely talked about, because what you see in the mainstream British media is a barrage of negative stereotypes, vilifying people of color, vilifying the Pakistanis, Muslims, Bangladeshis, always picking up on the negative headlines and really talking about what is going on within these communities, because these people migrated to the UK decades ago. Now they're British people. They are parts of the UK universe, and you just cannot link them back to the subcontinent or to the larger issue of Muslims or Islamophobia or whatever. But the solutions lie within the British society and politics, and we shall continue this conversation in the weeks and months to come. Thank you for joining us, and I hope if you like this video, please do share it and like it and subscribe to our channel.